They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that love can be thinner than paper when shame enters the picture. My name is Margaret Washington, I'm 58 years old, and this is the story of how the son I raised from nothing became everything I feared he might become, and how a secret worth $9.5 million changed both our lives forever. You might be wondering how a woman like me, who spent most of her life cleaning other people's messes, could end up hiding such an enormous fortune. You might be asking yourself what kind of person could reject the woman who sacrificed everything for them. Well, stick with me, because this story will take you through the darkest valleys of betrayal and the brightest peaks of redemption. It's a story about what happens when society's definition of success collides with the true meaning of family. And trust me, the ending will surprise you as much as it surprised me. Before I tell you about David, let me tell you about myself. I was born in rural Mississippi in 1967, the youngest of 6 children to parents who picked cotton for a living. We were poor, the kind of poor where you wear the same dress to school every day and pretend you're not hungry at lunch because there's no money for food. But we were rich in love, rich in faith, and rich in the belief that hard work could eventually lead to something better. My mama, God rest her soul, used to tell me, "Margaret, baby, your worth ain't measured by what you got in your pockets, but by what you got in your heart." She died when I was 17, and I moved north to Chicago looking for opportunities that didn't exist in Mississippi. I found work as a maid, then as a janitor, slowly building a life one minimum wage paycheck at a time. By the time I was 41, I'd been married once, briefly and disastrously, to a man who thought his fists were appropriate tools for solving disagreements. I left him after 6 months and never looked back. I'd lost 2 babies to miscarriages that broke my heart so completely I thought I'd never recover. I was alone, working 3 jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, but I was free. I was surviving. I thought that was enough. It was a cold February morning in 2001 when I first laid eyes on David. I was cleaning the restrooms at the downtown bus station, not the most glamorous job, but it paid better than some of my other work, and the hours allowed me to take on additional employment during the day. The bus station was always full of stories, people running towards something or away from something, carrying their hopes and fears in battered suitcases and worn backpacks. That particular morning started like any other. I'd arrived at 5 a.m. to clean before the morning rush began. The station was mostly empty except for a few homeless individuals seeking shelter from the February cold and some early commuters grabbing coffee before their buses arrived. I was scrubbing the floor near the waiting area when I heard it, this tiny, broken sobbing that seemed to echo off the walls. At first, I thought it might be one of the homeless men having a bad morning, or maybe someone who'd missed an important bus. But something about the sound made my heart clench. It was too small, too helpless, too full of despair that no adult should be able to produce. I followed the sound, my cleaning supplies forgotten, until I found the source. There he was, tucked behind one of the wooden benches like he was trying to make himself invisible to the world. This little white boy, maybe 5 years old, sitting alone with nothing but a torn teddy bear that had seen better days and eyes that had witnessed horrors I could only imagine. His blonde hair was matted with dirt and what looked like dried tears. His clothes, a too small t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees, were filthy and smelled like he'd been wearing them for days. But it was his eyes that broke my heart. They were the eyes of a child who had learned not to trust adults, not to expect comfort, not to believe in safety. When I approached him, moving slowly like you would with a frightened animal, he flinched and pressed himself further against the wall. His little body was shaking, whether from cold, fear, or hunger, I couldn't tell. Probably all 3. "Hey there, sweetheart," I whispered, kneeling down to his level despite the dirty floor soaking through my work pants. "Where's your mama?" He just shook his head and clutched that threadbare teddy bear tighter. Up close, I could see bruises on his thin arms, old ones that had faded to yellow and green, and fresher ones that were still purple and angry. My heart shattered. Someone had hurt this baby. Someone had abandoned this precious child like he was nothing more than trash. I didn't move closer, didn't try to touch him. I just sat there on that dirty bus station floor, talking to him in the gentlest voice I could manage. I told him my name. I told him I wasn't going to hurt him. I asked if he was hungry, if he was cold, if he needed help. Slowly, very slowly, he began to respond with tiny nods and shakes of his head. The police arrived within an hour of my call. Officer Martinez, a kind-faced woman who looked like she'd seen too much sadness in her career, knelt down beside the boy with the same careful gentleness I'd used. She explained later that they'd been looking for him for 3 days. His name was David, at least, that's what he'd told the first person who found him wandering downtown. No missing person reports had been filed. No frantic parents had called the police. No relatives had come forward. This little boy had simply been discarded. The social worker, a tired woman with kind eyes, explained that he'd likely end up in the system, bouncing from foster home to foster home. But something about this little boy grabbed hold of my heart and wouldn't let go. I was 41 then, working 3 jobs just to keep my head above water. I cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a grocery store during the day, and did laundry for wealthy families on weekends. I lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town, barely making ends meet. Taking on a child seemed impossible, but when I looked into David's frightened eyes, I knew I had to try. The adoption process was grueling. Social workers questioned everything: my income, my living situation, my ability to provide for a child as a single black woman. Some looked at me with skepticism, wondering why I wanted to adopt a white child. But I persisted. I sold everything I could, moved to a slightly better apartment with 2 bedrooms, and worked even more hours to prove I could provide for him. The system wasn't designed for women like me. The paperwork alone was overwhelming: background checks, financial statements, home inspections, psychological evaluations. I had to prove not just that I could provide for David, but that I deserved to provide for him. Some of the social workers were supportive, seeing the genuine love I had for this broken little boy. Others were openly hostile, questioning my motives and making subtle comments about appropriate placements that made my blood boil. Mrs. Henderson, the caseworker assigned to David's file, was particularly difficult. She was a thin, sharp-faced white woman who looked at me like I was trying to steal something that didn't belong to me. During our first meeting, she spread David's file across her desk like evidence in a criminal case. "Ms. Washington," she said, not bothering to look up from her papers, "I have to ask, why this child? We have several African American children in the system who might be more suitable matches for your household." I felt my temper flare, but I kept my voice steady. "Because this child needs a home, and I have love to give." "Color doesn't determine love, Mrs. Henderson." "That may be true," she replied coldly, "but practicality does determine success. This child has experienced significant trauma. He needs stability, resources, consistency. Your work schedule alone, 3 jobs, irregular hours, raises serious concerns about your ability to provide proper supervision." For months, I jumped through every hoop they placed in front of me. I attended parenting classes even though I'd helped raise my 5 siblings. I submitted to psychological evaluations that probed into every corner of my life and mind. I allowed strangers to inspect my home, my finances, my relationships, judging whether I was worthy of loving a child nobody else wanted. The financial requirements were the biggest challenge. I needed to prove I could support David without relying on government assistance, which meant demonstrating an income level that was nearly impossible to achieve with the jobs available to someone with my education and background. I took on a 4th job, cleaning offices on weekends, and still barely met their requirements. But the hardest part wasn't the bureaucracy or the financial strain. It was watching David during those months of uncertainty, seeing the fear in his eyes every time I visited him at the group home where he was staying. He'd grown attached to me, but he was terrified that I would disappear like everyone else in his short life. He would cling to me during visits, begging me not to leave, asking over and over if I was really going to take him home. "You promise you won't change your mind," he would whisper, his small hand gripping mine with desperate strength. "You promise you won't give me back." Those words haunted me during the darkest moments of the adoption process, when the bureaucratic obstacles seemed insurmountable and the social worker's skepticism felt crushing. This little boy had already been abandoned once. I couldn't let it happen again. The day David officially became my son was the happiest day of my life. He was so small in that courtroom, holding my hand with his tiny fingers. When the judge pronounced us a legal family, I cried tears of joy. David looked up at me and smiled for the first time since I'd found him. That smile was worth every sacrifice I'd ever made. The day David officially became my son was the happiest day of my life. He was so small in that courtroom, holding my hand with his tiny fingers. When the judge pronounced us a legal family, I cried tears of joy. David looked up at me and smiled for the first time since I'd found him. That smile was worth every sacrifice I'd ever made. But raising David wasn't easy. He had nightmares for months, screaming in the middle of the night about monsters and abandonment. I'd hold him until the shaking stopped, singing old gospel songs my grandmother had taught me. Slowly, he began to trust me. He started calling me Mama, not because I forced it, but because he chose to. Those early years were filled with struggle but also with pure love. The first year was the hardest. David had what the therapists called attachment disorder, a fancy term for a little boy who had learned that adults couldn't be trusted, that love was temporary, that safety was an illusion. He would test me constantly, pushing boundaries to see if I would abandon him like everyone else had. Some nights, he would wake up screaming, reliving nightmares about people who had hurt him in ways I could barely comprehend. He would call for Mommy Sarah, his birth mother, even though she was the one who had ultimately abandoned him. During the day, he would hoard food in his room, hiding snacks under his bed and in his closet because hunger had been a constant companion before I found him. The tantrums were epic. David would throw himself on the floor, screaming and hitting himself, destroying anything within reach. The first time it happened, I was terrified. This sweet little boy would transform into a hurricane of rage and pain, and nothing I said or did seemed to help. I called his therapist in tears, convinced I was failing him. "This is normal," Dr. Kim explained patiently. "He's testing your love. He's trying to see if you'll give up on him like everyone else did. The tantrums aren't really about whatever triggered them, they're about fear. He's afraid to love you because he's afraid you'll leave." So I learned to weather the storms. When David raged, I would sit nearby, not trying to stop him but simply being present. I would tell him, over and over, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You're safe with me." Sometimes it took hours. Sometimes he would exhaust himself and fall asleep on the floor, and I would carry him to bed, tucking him in like nothing had happened. The breakthrough came 8 months after the adoption was finalized. David was having one of his episodes, screaming about how I was going to send him back, like his birth mother had done. But this time, instead of just sitting nearby, I got down on the floor with him. "David," I said firmly, making him look at me through his tears. "I am your mama now. Forever. Not until you're good, not until you're perfect, not until you stop being sad or angry. Forever. Do you understand me? You would have to burn this house down with both of us in it before I would ever give up on you." He stopped crying and stared at me with those big blue eyes. "Really? Really? You're stuck with me, baby. Whether you like it or not." For the first time since I'd known him, David laughed. A real, genuine laugh that lit up his whole face. Then he threw his arms around my neck and sobbed, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of hope, of a little boy finally believing he was home. I remember his first day of school. I'd saved for months to buy him new clothes and supplies. When I walked him to the classroom, other parents stared. A few whispered. But David held my hand proudly, and when his teacher asked about his family tree project, he drew me right there in the center, with a big heart around us both. The early years weren't just about providing for David, they were about healing him from wounds I could barely understand. He would wake up screaming some nights, calling for someone named Mommy Sarah. I later learned from his therapist that Sarah was probably his birth mother, and the trauma of abandonment ran deeper than I'd initially realized. I spent countless hours researching childhood trauma, talking to counselors, learning how to help a little boy who flinched when adults raised their voices and hoarded food under his bed because he was afraid of being hungry again. Those were the hardest years of my life, but also the most rewarding. Watching David slowly learn to trust, to laugh freely, to believe that I wouldn't leave him like everyone else had. It was like watching a flower bloom after a long, harsh winter. He would test my love constantly, pushing boundaries to see if I would abandon him too. When he threw tantrums, broke things, or said hurtful words, I held firm with love and consistency. I never raised my hand to him, never threatened to send him away, never made my love conditional on his behavior. I remember the first time he told me he loved me. He was 7 years old, and we were reading a bedtime story. Out of nowhere, he looked up at me with those big eyes and whispered, "I love you, Mama Margaret. You won't leave me, right?" My heart broke and mended itself in the same moment. "Never," I promised him. "You're stuck with me forever." He giggled and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Write in the comments if you've ever had to fight for someone you love, even when the world questioned your choices. This story is just beginning. As David grew, so did my determination to give him every opportunity I'd never had. I worked 4 jobs, cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves early morning, doing laundry for rich families in the afternoons, and babysitting neighborhood kids in the evenings. I barely slept 3 hours a night, but seeing David excel in school made every exhausted moment worth it. He was brilliant, straight A's, honor roll, academic competitions. Teachers praised his intelligence, and I beamed with pride at every parent-teacher conference. I may have been the only mother there in a cleaning uniform instead of a business suit, but David was mine, and he was exceptional. But success came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. As David excelled academically, he began to notice the differences between our life and the lives of his classmates. He was invited to birthday parties at houses that were bigger than our entire apartment building. His friends had parents who were doctors, lawyers, business owners, people who drove nice cars and took vacations and never seemed to worry about money. I remember the first time David expressed embarrassment about our situation. He was 12, and his class was doing a career day where parents came to speak about their jobs. All week, he had been unusually quiet, and finally, the night before the event, he approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mama," he said softly, "do you have to come to career day?" My heart sank. "Why? Don't you want me there?" "It's just, what would you talk about?" "Cleaning. All the other parents are going to talk about important jobs, and you just clean things." I felt like he'd slapped me, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "David, there's nothing shameful about honest work. I clean things so that other people can do their jobs safely and comfortably. That's important." "But it's not the same," he insisted. "Tommy's dad is a surgeon. He saves people's lives. Jessica's mom is a lawyer. She fights for justice. You empty trash cans." That night, after David had gone to bed, I cried harder than I had since his adoption was finalized. Not because he was wrong, he wasn't. I did empty trash cans, scrub floors, wash other people's laundry. But because I realized that the world had already started teaching my precious boy that some people mattered more than others, and that his mama was one of the ones who mattered less. The next day, I went to career day anyway. I talked to David's class about the dignity of all work, about how every job contributes to making society function. I talked about responsibility, about showing up every day even when you're tired, about taking pride in doing your best no matter what your job is. Some of the kids listened respectfully. Others whispered and giggled. But David sat in the back of the room, staring at his desk, his face red with embarrassment. That night, I made him his favorite dinner and sat him down for a serious conversation. "David," I said, "I know you're not proud of what I do for work. And I understand why. But I need you to understand something important. Every hour I spend cleaning, every extra job I take on, every sacrifice I make, it's all for you. So that someday, you can have the kind of job that makes you proud. So that your children won't have to be embarrassed by what their parent does for a living." He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up at me with those blue eyes that had grown so serious over the years. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered. "I know you work hard for me. I just want to fit in." "I know, baby," I said, pulling him into a hug. And someday you will. You're going to be somebody important, David. But promise me something, when you become that important person, don't forget the woman who loved you when you were nobody special. Don't forget that love is more important than status. He promised. At 12 years old, sitting in our tiny kitchen, he looked me in the eyes and promised he would never forget. If only promises made by children could bind the men they become. When he turned 16, David started asking questions about college. Elite universities, law school, the kind of future that required money I didn't have. So I made a decision that nearly killed me. I took on a fifth job. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly wealthy widow, needed a live-in caretaker. The pay was good, but it meant leaving David alone most nights. Mrs. Whitman lived in a mansion in the richest part of the city. At 83, she was sharp as a tack but frail in body. She'd made her fortune in real estate decades ago and had no family left. I cooked for her, helped her bathe, organized her medications, and listened to her stories about the old days. She was demanding but fair, and surprisingly, she genuinely cared about David's future. Working for Mrs. Whitman was like stepping into another world. Her house had more bathrooms than our entire apartment had rooms. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with elaborate designs, and Persian rugs covered floors made of marble that probably cost more than I'd earned in my entire life. But Mrs. Whitman never made me feel small or out of place. She treated me with a dignity I'd rarely experienced from wealthy employers. The Whitman mansion was a testament to old money and good taste. Built in the 1920s, it sprawled across 3 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The main house had 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling books, a conservatory filled with exotic plants, and a dining room that could seat 20 people comfortably. Mrs. Whitman had been born in this house and had lived her entire life within its walls, watching the world change from behind leaded glass windows. But despite all this luxury, Mrs. Whitman was lonely. Her husband had died 15 years earlier, and they'd never had children. Her siblings were all deceased, and the few cousins she had left lived scattered across the country and rarely visited. I was often the only person she spoke to for days at a time, and I think that's why our relationship evolved beyond typical employer-employee boundaries. You know, Margaret, she would say during our evening conversations over tea served on china that was older than I was, I've had many people work for me over the years. Most saw me as a paycheck. But you see me as a person. That's rare in this world. She was right, I did see her as a person. Despite her wealth, despite the vast differences in our backgrounds, Mrs. Whitman was just another human being navigating the loneliness and challenges of aging. She had fears about her health, regrets about choices she'd made decades ago, and dreams that had never come true. We would sit in her sunroom, surrounded by orchids she'd cultivated for 50 years, and she would tell me stories about her life that I don't think she'd ever shared with anyone else. Mrs. Whitman would ask about David constantly, wanting to know about his grades, his dreams, his challenges. When I told her about the racist comments some of his classmates had made about having a black mother, she was furious. Ignorance, she'd snap, her proper composure cracking to reveal genuine anger. Pure ignorance. That boy is lucky to have you, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth knowing. She took a particular interest in David's education, often asking to see his report cards and school projects. When he won a statewide essay contest in his junior year, she insisted I bring her a copy of his winning piece. She read it 3 times, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "This boy has a gift," she said. "A real gift. You must make sure he gets to Harvard, Margaret. Promise me." "Mrs. Whitman, Harvard costs more money than I'll make in 10 years, I replied, though my heart swelled with pride at her recognition of David's talent. "Leave that to me," she said mysteriously. And true to her word, when David's Harvard acceptance letter arrived with a partial scholarship, Mrs. Whitman quietly made up the difference. She made me promise never to tell David where the additional funding came from. Let him think he earned it all on merit, she insisted. Young men need to believe in their own capabilities. But mothers need help sometimes, and there's no shame in accepting it when it's offered with love. "That boy of yours has potential," she'd tell me during our evening tea. Don't you let anyone tell you different, Margaret. Smart is smart, regardless of where it comes from. David graduated valedictorian. I was so proud I thought my heart might burst. He got into Harvard Law School with a partial scholarship, but we still needed money for housing, books, and living expenses. I refinanced everything I could and took out loans I wasn't sure I could ever repay. Mrs. Whitman even helped quietly, though David never knew. The day I drove David to Harvard, he hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm going to make you proud, Mama. I'm going to be somebody important someday." "You already are somebody important," I told him. "You're my son." But as the years passed, something changed. David's phone calls became shorter, less frequent. When he came home for holidays, he seemed different, more distant, more critical of our modest life. He'd grown sophisticated, speaking with new vocabulary and mannerisms I didn't recognize. He was becoming the successful man I'd always dreamed he'd be, but somehow, I was feeling more like a stranger in his presence. During his second year, he brought home a girlfriend, Jessica, a blonde girl from old money whose father owned several companies. She was polite but cold, looking around our small apartment like she was afraid to touch anything. David seemed embarrassed, making excuses for why we couldn't go to the nicer restaurant in town. That night, after Jessica had gone to her hotel, David and I had our first real argument. "Mama, you have to understand," he said, pacing our tiny living room. "My life is different now. The people I associate with, the opportunities one have, they come with expectations." "What kind of expectations?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "Image matters. Perception matters. I can't have my future colleagues thinking I come from this." He gestured around our apartment with disgust I'd never seen in his eyes before. My heart shattered, but I tried to stay strong. "This is your home, David. I worked myself to the bone to give you opportunities. Don't you forget where you came from." "That's exactly the problem," he said coldly. "I can't afford to remember where I came from. The man I'd raised, the boy who used to draw me in the center of his family tree, was disappearing before my eyes, and I didn't know how to save him." After David graduated Harvard and started working at a prestigious law firm in the city, our relationship deteriorated rapidly. He moved into an expensive downtown apartment and rarely visited. When he did call, it was brief and formal, like he was checking an obligation off his list. I continued working for Mrs. Whitman, who was now in her late 80s and increasingly dependent on my care. She noticed my sadness and often asked about David. I'd make excuses: "He's busy with work, he's building his career." But Mrs. Whitman was too wise to be fooled. "Pride is a dangerous thing, Margaret," she'd say, patting my hand. "It can make people forget what truly matters." David's law firm specialized in corporate defense, representing big companies against everyday people like me. The irony wasn't lost on me: the boy I'd raised to fight for justice was now fighting for those who could afford to buy it. He was making good money, driving a luxury car, and dating Jessica seriously. According to the photos on his social media, which I checked religiously, he was living the American dream. But I barely existed in that dream anymore. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I decided to surprise David at his office. I'd saved up to buy him an expensive watch for his 30th birthday, something I thought would make him proud to have a mother who cared enough to sacrifice for him. I dressed in my best clothes, the navy blue dress I wore to church on Sundays, and took 3 buses to get to his downtown office building. The journey to David's office was humiliating before I even arrived. The bus drivers and passengers looked at me strangely: a middle-aged black woman in an obviously inexpensive dress, carrying a gift bag from a store that was probably beyond her means, heading to the financial district where she clearly didn't belong. I felt their judgment, but I pushed through it because I believed David would be happy to see me. I believed wrong. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper. Everything was marble and mahogany, with lawyers in $1,000 suits walking around like they owned the world. The receptionist looked at me suspiciously when I asked for David Montgomery. He'd started using his adoptive last name professionally instead of mine. She made me wait in the lobby for 20 minutes, probably hoping I'd get uncomfortable and leave. But I'd waited much longer than 20 minutes for David before. I could wait as long as it took. David? I called out when I spotted him in the hallway, talking with several colleagues. Surprise. The look on his face wasn't surprise, it was horror. Pure, undiluted horror, like I'd committed some unforgivable sin by existing in his workspace. His colleagues, including Jessica who now worked at the same firm, stared at me with a mixture of confusion and disdain. Margaret, he said stiffly, not calling me Mama like he used to. What are you doing here? I brought you something for your birthday, I said, holding out the wrapped watch box with shaking hands. I wanted to see where my successful son works. The silence was deafening. I could see Jessica whispering something to another woman, both of them looking at me like I was some kind of curiosity. David's jaw was clenched so tight I thought it might snap. This isn't a good time, he said, not taking the gift. We'll talk later. But we both knew later would never come. I left that watch on the reception desk and walked out with what remained of my dignity. That night, I cried harder than I had since the day I found David at that bus station 29 years ago. Have you ever felt invisible to someone you love? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone. The final confrontation came 3 months later, and it destroyed what was left of my heart. David called me on a Friday evening, his voice cold and businesslike. Margaret, we need to talk. I'm coming over. When he arrived at my apartment, he wasn't alone. Jessica was with him, wearing an engagement ring that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. They sat on my old couch like they were afraid it might contaminate their expensive clothes. Congratulations on your engagement, I said, trying to smile despite the pain. When's the wedding? That's what we need to discuss, David said, not meeting my eyes. Jessica's family is very traditional, very particular about associations. The wedding will be a major social event with important clients and colleagues. My stomach dropped. I knew where this was going. Margaret, Jessica said, her voice sickeningly sweet, we think it would be best if you maintain some distance during this period. David's career is at a crucial point, and we need to be careful about appearances. What Jessica means, David said, still not looking at me, is that I think you should find somewhere else to live. Permanently. The words hit me like a physical blow. David, this is my home. This is where I raised you. I'll pay for a nice place across town, he said, pulling out his checkbook like he was paying for a service. Somewhere more appropriate for someone in your situation. My situation? I stood up, anger and heartbreak warring in my chest. You mean being your mother? For the first time that night, he looked directly at me. His eyes were stranger's eyes, cold, calculating, empty of the love that had once filled them. You're not my mother, he said quietly. You were my guardian, my caretaker. But let's be honest about what this was. You took me in because you needed purpose, and I stayed because I needed shelter and support. But I don't need that anymore. I don't need you anymore. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. Jessica was examining her nails, probably wishing she was anywhere else. David sat there like a statue, waiting for me to accept his dismissal like some employee being laid off. I see, I whispered, my voice barely audible. After everything I sacrificed, everything I gave up, this is how you repay me. I didn't ask you to sacrifice anything, he snapped. Those were your choices. But now I'm making mine. I need you to understand, there's no place for you in my future. Jessica and I are building something important, and we can't have complications. Complications. That's what I'd become to the boy I'd loved more than my own life. Fine, I said, standing up straighter than I had in months. I'll pack my things. But David, answer me one question. When you look in the mirror, do you recognize the man staring back at you? He didn't answer. They left 20 minutes later, David placing a check for $5,000 on my kitchen table like a tip for 30 years of service. That night, I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by boxes and memories, and made a phone call that would change everything. Mrs. Whitman had passed away 6 months earlier, and her lawyer had been trying to reach me about her will. I'd been too devastated about David to deal with legal matters, but now I had nothing left to lose. Before her death, Mrs. Whitman had grown increasingly concerned about my relationship with David. During her final months, when her health was failing rapidly, she would often grab my hand with surprising strength and say, "Margaret, promise me you won't let that boy destroy your sense of worth. You are valuable with or without his approval." I would smile and reassure her, but privately I was already falling apart as David's distance grew more obvious. The last conversation I had with Mrs. Whitman was 3 days before she passed. She was lucid but weak, lying in her enormous bed surrounded by medical equipment. "I've been thinking about legacy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not the money, anyone can leave money. I mean real legacy. The mark we leave on other people's hearts." She squeezed my hand. "You've left the most beautiful mark on that boy's heart, even if he's too proud and stupid to see it right now. But someday he will. And when he does, I want you to have choices. Real choices." I thought she was just being kind, offering comfort to a woman whose heart was breaking. I never imagined she was planning something that would change my entire life. What I learned in that phone call would have shocked David to his core, if he'd cared enough to listen. But he'd made his choice, and now I would make mine. I moved to a small apartment across town, just like David had suggested. It was modest but clean, in a neighborhood where people smiled at each other and children played in the streets. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating on rejection and betrayal. But David's cruelty had awakened something in me I didn't know existed, a desire to prove that worth isn't measured by the clothes you wear or the address on your mailbox. Mrs. Whitman had seen something in me that my own son refused to acknowledge, and her final gift would become the foundation of my revenge. You see, Mrs. Whitman had been more than just my employer. During those long years caring for her, she'd become something like a friend, despite the difference in our circumstances. She'd listened to my stories about David with growing concern, watching as his success transformed him into someone neither of us recognized. "That boy is losing himself," she'd say during our evening conversations. "Success without character is just expensive failure." Mrs. Whitman had no children, no close relatives, and very few friends left alive. Her vast fortune, accumulated through decades of smart real estate investments, had no obvious heir. What I discovered from her lawyer made me sit down hard in my new apartment's single chair. She'd left me $9.5 million. $9.5 million. The will was ironclad, witnessed and notarized, with a personal letter explaining her reasoning. Mrs. Whitman had watched me sacrifice everything for David's future while he slowly grew ashamed of me. She'd seen genuine love in action and wanted to reward it, but more than that, she wanted to give me the power to choose my own path. "Margaret," the letter read in her careful handwriting, "you gave that boy everything, including pieces of yourself you'll never get back. Now it's time to give something to yourself. Use this money however you see fit, but promise me you'll remember your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. You are valuable because of who you are, not because of what you do for ungrateful children." For weeks, I sat with this secret, unsure what to do with it. I could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, or lived in luxury for the rest of my life. Instead, I did something that would have made Mrs. Whitman proud. I started helping others. Quietly, anonymously, I began funding scholarships for kids from low-income families. I donated to programs that helped single mothers get job training. I supported community centers in neighborhoods like the one where I'd raised David. Every dollar I spent felt like a small victory against the shame he'd tried to make me feel about my life. But I also watched David from a distance. Social media made it easy to track his seemingly perfect life. The elaborate wedding with Jessica, the promotion to junior partner, the expensive car, the house in the suburbs. He looked successful and happy, but I'd raised him long enough to recognize the signs of stress around his eyes, the forced nature of his social media smiles. 18 months after he'd kicked me out, David's perfect world began to crumble. It started with a lawsuit against his firm, a class action suit representing hundreds of families who'd lost their homes due to predatory lending practices. The firm that had made David rich was being accused of helping banks steal from people exactly like the woman who'd raised him. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Then came the personal problems. Jessica filed for divorce, claiming David's obsession with work had destroyed their marriage. The real reason, according to the gossip I overheard at the grocery store where I still shopped, was that she'd found out about his humble origins and felt deceived. She wanted half of everything in the divorce, including his stake in the law firm. Finally, the financial crisis hit. Bad investments, legal fees, and divorce settlements left David drowning in debt. His perfect life was imploding exactly the way mine had when he'd abandoned me, but he had no one to catch him when he fell. That's when I made my decision. Not because I wanted him back, that naive hope had died the night he called me a complication. But because Mrs. Whitman had been right about something else. Success without character is just expensive failure, and maybe, just maybe, losing everything might help David remember who he used to be. The call came on a Thursday morning. I almost didn't answer when I saw David's name on my phone screen, but something made me pick up. Margaret? His voice was different, smaller, uncertain, stripped of the arrogance that had defined him for the past few years. I need help. I didn't respond immediately. I'd imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, I felt strangely calm. I'm losing everything, he continued, his voice cracking. The firm is going under, Jessica took half of what I had left, and I can't make my mortgage payments. I know I don't deserve to ask, but I don't have anyone else. I'm about to lose my house, and I don't know what to do. Still, I said nothing. I let him sit in the silence he'd created between us. I was wrong, he whispered, and I heard something I hadn't heard in his voice for years, genuine emotion. I was so wrong, Margaret. I threw away the most important person in my life because I was ashamed of being loved by someone the world told me wasn't good enough. But you were always good enough. You were everything. I closed my eyes, remembering the little boy who used to have nightmares, who would draw me in the center of his family tree, who called me Mama with pure love in his voice. Where are you living now? I asked finally. A studio apartment downtown. It's all I can afford. I lost the house last month. That night, I made an anonymous donation to save David's law firm. Not the whole amount, that would have raised questions, but enough to keep them afloat and cover his immediate debts. I used a shell company Mrs. Whitman's lawyers had helped me set up for my charitable donations. David never knew it was me. As far as he was concerned, a mysterious investor had decided to bail out the firm for reasons no one understood. He kept his job, avoided bankruptcy, and slowly began rebuilding his life from the ashes of his previous arrogance. But I wasn't done. Over the following months, I watched him change. The near loss of everything had humbled him in ways I never could have. He started taking pro bono cases, helping people who reminded me of myself, hard-working folks who'd been taken advantage by the system. He volunteered at a community center in the same neighborhood where we'd once lived together. And then, 6 months after that desperate phone call, he did something that surprised me. He came to my apartment. I answered the door to find David standing there with grocery bags in his hands and tears in his eyes. He looked older, humbler, more like the boy I'd raised and less like the stranger he'd become. "Can I cook dinner for you?" he asked simply. "I learned how to make your favorite, pot roast with vegetables, the way you used to make it when I was little." For 2 years, we slowly rebuilt our relationship. Not the same relationship we'd had before, too much had been said and done to pretend otherwise. But something new, something honest. David never asked me for money, never expected me to solve his problems. Instead, he showed up. He called regularly. He introduced me to his new girlfriend, Maria, a public defender who treated me with respect and genuine affection. He still didn't know about the $9.5 million. He didn't know I'd been the anonymous benefactor who'd saved his career. And he didn't need to know, not yet. But on his 33rd birthday, 3 years after he'd called me a complication, I decided it was time for the whole truth. I invited him and Maria over for dinner at my modest apartment. After we'd eaten and shared stories, I placed an envelope on the table between us. David, I said, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been keeping secret. He looked nervous, probably wondering if I was sick or in trouble. Maria held his hand supportively. I told him about Mrs. Whitman. About the will. About the money I'd inherited and kept hidden for 4 years. About the anonymous donations that had saved his firm, funded scholarships, and helped hundreds of people in our community. The silence that followed was different from that awful night when he'd kicked me out. This silence was full of shock, disbelief, and slowly dawning understanding. $9.5 million, he whispered. All this time, you had $9.5 million, and you never said anything? What would you have done if you'd known? I asked gently. When you were kicking me out, calling me a complication, would it have changed anything? Or would you have just wanted the money? He was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what I was telling him. You saved my firm, he said finally. That mysterious investor, that was you. I nodded. You needed to learn some lessons on your own. Money would have just delayed the inevitable. David started crying then, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from years of buried shame and regret. Maria rubbed his back while he cried, and I sat there feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said between sobs. I threw away 30 years of love for what? For the approval of people who didn't even really care about me? For a life that turned out to be empty and meaningless? No, I said firmly. You don't deserve forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't earned, it's given. And I'm choosing to give it to you, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger was poisoning my heart. We talked until 3 a.m. About pain and pride, about family and love, about the difference between success and worth. David apologized for things I'd forgotten and things I'd never forget. I explained why I'd helped him anonymously, not to control him or make him dependent, but to give him the chance to find his way back to the man I'd always believed he could be. If you've ever had to choose between bitterness and healing, you'll understand how hard that conversation was. But also how necessary. Today, 5 years after David kicked me out of his life, we have dinner together every Sunday. He's married to Maria now, and they're expecting their first child, a little girl they're planning to name Eleanor, after Mrs. Whitman. David runs a non-profit law clinic that provides free legal services to low-income families, funded largely by my anonymous donations. I still live in my modest apartment, still drive my old car, still shop at the same grocery store. But now I do those things by choice, not necessity. I've established the Eleanor Whitman Foundation, which provides scholarships, job training, and legal aid to people who need second chances. David serves on the board, though he still doesn't know I fund it almost entirely myself. We don't talk about the money often. David knows I have it, but he's never asked for any of it, and I've never offered. What we've rebuilt is more valuable than any inheritance. It's a relationship based on respect, honesty, and genuine love rather than obligation or need. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd revealed the money earlier. Would it have prevented his cruel dismissal of me? Would it have changed his character development? I'll never know, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. What I do know is this: David had to lose everything to find himself. He had to experience the emptiness of success without love, the loneliness of achievement without character, the hollow victory of gaining the world while losing his soul. And I had to learn that my worth was never dependent on how he treated me. It was inherent in who I am, not who I am to someone else. Mrs. Whitman's money gave me the power to choose forgiveness over revenge, healing over bitterness. But the strength to make those choices came from something money can't buy, the knowledge that I'd loved completely and without condition, even when that love wasn't returned. The little boy I found crying at the bus station 35 years ago is still there, somewhere inside the man who calls me Mama again. He's just learned, the hard way, that some things are worth more than money, status, or the approval of people who judge you for loving someone society tells you isn't good enough. In 3 months, I'll become a grandmother. David and Maria are already talking about how their daughter will know her grandma Margaret, how she'll learn about love and sacrifice and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. They've asked me to move closer to them when the baby comes, and I'm considering it, not because I need taking care of, but because family is about choice, and I choose them just as I hope they choose me. The $9.5 million sits mostly untouched in investment accounts, growing larger each year as I give away the interest to people who need it more than I do. It's become a tool for healing rather than a source of power, and Mrs. Whitman would approve of that. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. If you've ever felt discarded by someone you love, remember this: their inability to see your worth doesn't diminish it. If you've ever had to choose between bitterness and forgiveness, know that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the strongest thing a human heart can do. And if you've ever wondered whether love can survive betrayal and rebuild itself into something even stronger, I'm here to tell you it can. But both people have to choose it, every single day, with humility and grace and the understanding that family isn't just about blood or adoption papers, it's about showing up, especially when it's hard. Subscribe for more stories about the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. And remember, you are valuable not because of what you can do for others, but because of who you are. Don't let anyone, not even someone you love more than life itself, convince you otherwise. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with justice. This one ends with something better, redemption, and the quiet victory of a love that refused to die, even when it seemed impossible to survive.